Recently, over the past few months, I've been seeing a lot of headlines on what's better, sugarcane or high fructose corn syrup. Seems to originate from RFK Jr.'s MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again. He's been heard saying that sugar is the healthier alternative to the high fructose corn syrup, typically found in American drinks. There were claims that he was going to take on Coca-Cola and force them to switch to using sugarcane. These claims were never actually verified though, and both RFK Jr. and Coca-Cola have denied them. These kinds of rumors online have helped stir the pot and bring attention to the topic of whether or not sugarcane is actually better than high fructose corn syrup. Most media online seem to defend high fructose corn syrup, with the claim that they're essentially the same thing, and switching could hurt farmers in the Midwest who receive government subsidies. In addition, cane sugar is not grown widely in the United States to actually replace high fructose corn syrup. Corn is way more plentiful. Removing the political ramifications that could appear after making the switch and how it would affect existing farms, the argument seems to kind of break down. Sugarcane is not the only source of sugar. Sugar, as we know it, is a chemical compound known as sucrose, which is found in many other plants. In fact, the most common source of sugar, table sugar, in the United States actually comes from sugar beets, which are grown to a great extent in the Midwest, just like corn. Moving on to the claim that sugar and fructose are essentially the same, thus wouldn't result in any differences on the impact of health. A lot of people online seem to say this because the chemical formula for sucrose is a glucose molecule bonded to a fructose molecule, effectively making it 50-50 glucose, fructose. It's about the ratio of the same simple sugars that are found in high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup having a bit more fructose, but almost half and half. It's like 55% fructose. So the main difference between sucrose and high fructose corn syrup is that bond between the glucose and the fructose, making sucrose a disaccharide, meaning two sugars, whereas high fructose corn syrup is just a mixture of two monosaccharides, single sugars. The thought is that the minor difference shouldn't result in any difference in how the body processes these sugars. Anyone with education in organic chemistry will tell you this kind of thinking has led to pharmaceutical companies causing irreparable damage to large populations, like we saw with thalidomide back in the 1960s. Thalidomide was used initially as a medication for morning sickness. At the time, it would also be used for insomnia, coughs, colds, headaches. The problem is that there were two forms of this drug that were being produced. The forms of the drug were identical, except there's a little bit of a difference in the shape. The two forms, known as enantiomers, were mirror images of each other. Same chemical formula, same bonds. The only exception is a nitrogen bonded to a carbon, which would have been in a different direction or orientation, depending on the enantiomer. So there is an R enantiomer, which is generally considered safe. The other is the S enantiomer, which was known to cause birth defects. Babies would be born with missing body parts and would often not survive their malformities. This one drug caused the world to increase drug regulations and monitoring by a great amount. If a simple difference, such as the shape of a molecule, can lead to such vast differences in side effects, why wouldn't you think it's possible for sucrose and high fructose corn syrup to react differently in our bodies? Maybe we can go back to why this topic was ever brought up by that MAHA movement in the first place. Studies have shown that high fructose, the simple sugar fructose, consumption of that simple sugar can fatigue the liver. So the liver is what processes most of your fructose, whereas glucose is readily used for energy in our body throughout the process of glycolysis. So it doesn't need to be broken down or changed or altered before that process takes place. The liver is frequently an abused organ with the consumption of alcohol, medications. The additional stress of consuming large amounts of fructose, which is found in many of our snacks and drinks, is bad for the liver. But there is fructose in sucrose, right? It makes up half the molecule. Wouldn't that mean it's just as bad? Well, because sucrose is a disaccharide, it needs to be broken down into glucose and fructose before it can be used. This process happens primarily in the small intestine, where the enzyme sucrase breaks the bond between the fructose and the glucose. So once the sucrose is broken down into the smaller sugars, they can be absorbed by the intestine and be released into the bloodstream, where the fructose will be processed by the liver. You might think this is the same as high fructose corn syrup after all, right? No. Since high fructose corn syrup is made of simple sugars that do not need to be broken down, it begins to be absorbed as soon as it enters your stomach. The delayed absorption of sucrose allows for potentially hundreds of additional factors to take place and affect how sucrose is absorbed as compared to high fructose corn syrup. For instance, our body's ability to absorb nutrients from our food is not perfect. Sucrose is absorbed in a very different timeline compared to high fructose corn syrup, due to it needing to pass the stomach and make its way to the small intestine. And even in the small intestine, it takes time to break down as it travels through the intestine. It does not get absorbed immediately. Understand that our small intestines are quite long, and the reason why they are so long is so we can absorb as much from our food as possible. Does the slow release of sugar from sucrose make any difference compared to the quick absorption of high fructose corn syrup? Maybe. There isn't a lot of research or studies to make certain conclusions, but it is thought that sucrose is indeed less damaging to the liver. Maybe the slower release is part of that reason. There are other factors like your body's ability to produce sucrase. Some people have deficiency, kind of like how people are lactose intolerant because they don't produce enough lactase. Lactose being another disaccharide, by the way. Your hydration levels may affect your absorption differently between these two sweeteners. There are many theories, and some of these are my theories for what could be the differences between sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, but I'll admit I am not a researcher and I have fairly basic knowledge in the field. But studies have indeed been conducted to show that they do in fact differ. One study showed mice consuming high fructose corn syrup had increased fat accumulation as compared to the mice consuming sucrose. It is important to note that sucrose also showed increase in fat accumulation, just not as much. Again, just because one might be worse than the other doesn't mean the other's still good for you. Any consumption of sweet foods and drinks should be left to a minimum. Even artificial sweeteners, you should probably leave your consumption to a minimum for other reasons I will not go into here. There was another study that showed increased inflammation caused by high fructose corn syrup, getting more into RFK Jr.'s obsession of reducing inflammation. And this other study showing inflammation was actually done on people, not mice. Inflammation is thought to be a cause for our vulnerability to many illnesses and diseases. I know a lot less about those claims, but I do know that inflammation in your body is generally seen as a bad thing. If this study is true, the switch from high fructose corn syrup to sucrose would seem pretty well justified. All this being said, these studies have not been subject to rigorous peer review or any kind of outside data validation to my knowledge. There have been some reproduced studies, but I guess not enough to make this science generally accepted as of yet. The point of me saying all this is not for me to prove one way or the other that high fructose corn syrup is truly the inferior sweetener. It's more so meant to get people to stop believing in spreading bad science without doing your due diligence. Just because a politician says something doesn't automatically make it false. It also doesn't make it true. Point is, just try to keep an open mind.